Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Welcome to this year's Hannah's Bookukkah, where I try to post for all 8 nights of Hanukkah. Some years I make a hodgepodge of different videos, and other years I do deep dives into particular authors. This year is one of those deep dive years, and the author I want to focus on for the next 8 nights is Eudora Welty, one of my favorite 20th century Southern authors. In the coming videos, I'll talk in more detail about Welty's life, as well as about the diversity of her writing, but for today I want to start with one of my very favorite pieces of hers, which was also one of the earliest stories that Welty published, the short story Why I Live at the P.O. The initials P.O. here, for anyone who doesn't know, refers to the local post office, which receives and distributes U.S. mail. I decided to memorize the story when I was still in high school, and I have recited it or read it aloud I don't know how many times to friends and family, and to students too, in Southern history classes. Even more than that, Welty's words are now my words too. I find myself using specific lines and phrases from this story in my regular conversations at least once a week. In other words, this story is now part of my DNA. And some of those phrases have even popped out a few times in videos over the years. If you don't know this story already, I encourage you to go read a copy or to listen to an audio version of the story. Because of the style of this story, which we'll talk about in a minute, it is ideally suited for listening to someone read it to you. There are several versions on YouTube, including one by me, which I made years ago, soon after I started my channel. I will leave a link to it down in the description box, and I'll also link to the story published in the magazine The Atlantic back in 1941 if you'd prefer to read it yourself. Welty had a few different registers when she wrote, but one of them that really stands out is humor, a specifically regional kind of humor that's distinctly rooted in orality or oral storytelling. The author is writing about American Southerners, typically white Southerners, but not always, as we'll see in future videos. And these people are themselves storytellers, immersed in a culture that deeply values the pleasures of the spoken word, shared with a small group. Quite recently, Steve Donahue was talking about how storytelling traditions in Ireland almost certainly contributed to the magnificence of Irish literature. And I would argue that the same thing is true about Southern literature and the literature of Black Americans, who in large numbers are from the South or have roots in the South. In other words, that sense of orality, despite a long history of massive racial segregation and other forms of discrimination and violence, which we will see to a degree in some of Welty's writing, is one of the things that unites Southerners all along the racial divide. Why I Live at the P.O. doesn't just include some of that oral culture. Instead, it is in its entirety a monologue spoken aloud by the I of the title and presented to a visitor. We'll talk a little later about how we know that, but let's talk first about what's actually going on. The story starts. I was getting along fine with Mama, Papa Daddy, and Uncle Rondo till my sister Stella Rondo just separated from her husband and came back home again. Right off the bat, we know that family conflict between adult family members is going to be important in the story. We know a little more. For example, they seem to be a tight group, and we might guess, even from that first sentence, that the whole family lives together. Family relationships are clearly a key part of their lives. That's why they have names so tied to their family roles. Even the one person in the sentence without a name like Mama or Uncle is clearly related here, partially named after one of the other characters. And while we haven't yet learned the narrator's name, we will soon, Sister. And she is called that not only by her actual sibling, but by her uncle, her mother, and her grandfather Papa Daddy. That naming pattern might sound ludicrous to you, but I myself, growing up in the South, called one of my second cousins once removed by the name Sister, and so did my mother, as did her mother, who would refer to her daughter Sister. As we go on in the first paragraph, we learn that Stella Rondo had met her husband, Mr. Whitaker, while she was living at home. He had come to the small town of China Grove from the north to start a business, taking posed pictures of people and then selling the prints to them. When Stella Rondo first met him, he was dating someone else, sister. So presumably he was dating his sister? And now she's come home, the first separation in the story, which is mentioned in the very first sentence. In the literary monologue, Sister blames Stella Rondo for breaking them up, suggesting that Stella Rondo told Mr. Whitaker a silly lie about her that turned him against her. Stella Rondo and Mr. Whitaker ran off and got married, moving to, quote, one of those towns up in Illinois. That is, not the South. Sister then says that Stella Rondo, quote, to our complete surprise, brought home this child of 2. She had not told anyone in her family that she had a child, one already 2 years old. Stella Rondo quickly responds, why, Mama, Shirley T's adopted. I can prove it. Now, Sister knows the child isn't adopted and recognizes that the little girl looks like a cross between Papa Daddy and Mr. Whitaker. By saying that, she's suggesting that the child is Stella's biological daughter. So, the main strain that's going on at the beginning is really between the two sisters. The one who has been stuck at home and is narrating the story clearly is irritated because her own boyfriend ran off with her sister Stella Rondo, and Sister blames her sister, that is Stella Rondo, for his decision. It gave Stella Rondo a way to get out of China Grove, a kind of independence maybe, which we'll circle back to later. Already in these first few paragraphs, Welty has set something up that the text doesn't say outright. By choosing to write the story as a first-person monologue, Welty has to use subtext to get it across. One thing we know, or at least know is possible, is that the reason Mr. Whitaker, quote, turned against the narrator was not because of Stella Rondo's telling of a lie about her sister, but instead because of Stella Rondo's willingness to engage in premarital sex with him, apparently while he was dating her sister, who probably was not willing to sleep with him. That is what turned his affections. Keep in mind that this was the small town South before the entry of the U.S. into World War II. Premarital sex, and especially premarital pregnancy, was something shameful. Stella Rondo simply did not tell her family she had a child. And when her marriage failed and she returned home, either because she left Mr. Whitaker or because he kicked her out, she had to figure out how to explain the presence of a child too old to have been conceived in marriage. So she claimed the girl was adopted. So that is one subtext Welty makes sure we have enough information to see. One of the other subtexts already becoming clear is that Sister is telling her own side of the story, still in a moment of great anger as she narrates. She's not at all sympathetic, much less trying to lay out what really happened. Sometimes readers call Sister an unreliable narrator, but I'm not sure I would say that exactly. Instead, she's writing from a very particular perspective and emotion, and both her perspective and her irritation shape how she tells the story. We can't rely on her to tell the whole truth, but we do have a pretty clear understanding from the very beginning of the story what she's doing. And that makes me resist the idea that she's unreliable. We can rely on her to tell us stuff that she thinks will benefit herself. Whoever's listening to this monologue surely can tell, as well as we do, that she is not telling us some real truth, but also that the, quote, truth of what happened is absolutely not the point of this monologue. The idea of an author really trying to paint a character from within their own perspective, and yet also allow readers to see why it isn't the full truth, is in many ways quite a modernist choice, a part of literary modernism. Here we are in this very small town story full of eccentric Southern characters using Well, not dialect exactly, but certainly Southern speech patterns, both cadences and idioms that are regionally specific. This is a culture deeply and proudly connected to a sense of history. So this world might not be where we'd expect modernist writing to be coming from. But that is what we're seeing, in my opinion, with a bit of reshaping of what interiority and presentation mean. We'll talk more about these issues as the week goes on and as we learn more about Eudora Welty's experiences and other literary works. Okay, back to what I'm calling subtext, things that the narrator doesn't say, but the author nevertheless finds a way to show us readers, this time through naming. While names show family connection in the beginning, now we get something else. The little girl has a name explicitly linked to the world outside family and outside the South. She's Shirley T., short for Shirley Temple, a child star of those days that tap danced and sang and seemed to become sort of a representation of the whole of America, transcending region. Having this sort of anti-family and maybe even anti-South kind of name emphasized her outsiderness. At this point, we start getting an hysterical account of the snide bickering that starts happening in the household. Sister paints it as if Stellaranda was trying to get each family member to turn against Sister, one by one, to side with her in their little feud and against Sister. Perhaps that is indeed the case. Or perhaps it was just how Sister saw things. Or maybe it's just how she chooses to paint them when she tells the story. We have no idea. And I don't think we're supposed to know or care. I really hope you'll read this middle section for yourself, but I'm going to skip to the end. Incidentally, this is not a situation where there is anything to spoil. No surprises that you might want to discover yourself, I don't think. The family has been celebrating the 4th of July, that is, Independence Day in the U.S., and things finally have come to a head. Sister has gotten so irritated that she decides to move out of the house to get away from her relatives. And because of family connections, she happens to be the town's postmistress. Not a big job, since, as Sister says, quote, "My family are naturally the main people in China Grove." So there isn't a lot of work to do. Still, the little post office gives her a place to go. Before she leaves her home, she gathers up everything that is hers to take with her. Then she tries to lay claim to a lot of things that are not so clearly hers, including flowers blooming in her family's front yard. So she heads to the post office on this 4th of July holiday to establish her own independence. She tries to make a home for herself. As she tells the unidentified visitor, which we'll talk more about in a minute, she says the following. "Oh, I like it here. It's ideal, as I've been saying. You see, I've got everything cater-cornered just the way I like it. Hear the radio? All the war news. Radio, sewing machine, bookends, ironing board, and that great big piano lamp. Peace. That's what I like." Now that's an interesting list. First, many of the objects are only part of a pair. Bookends with no books. An ironing board, but no mention of an iron. A great big piano lamp without its piano. When Sister moved to the PO, she separated these objects from their contexts, where they belonged, just as she separated herself. And of course, since she's no longer surrounded by the noise of her family's conversations, she fills the silence with the radio. On one hand, the radio connects her to a much larger world. She's hearing news from all over the world. Still, it doesn't really connect her, does it? She's not able to talk back. And she doesn't really connect inside herself. All the war news she hears on the radio simply offers her comfort. Quote, "Peace, that's what I like." But there simply is no peace. Not for the world and not for Sister's family. There is war in the world and war in the family. Let me talk about that war news for a moment. I think this is another place where Welty is putting in a lot of visible subtext. Why I Live with the P.O. was written when America was still in its isolationist phase. And isolation is, of course, what Sister's chosen, too. But Americans, by the time, pretty much knew that American involvement was inevitable and possibly happening soon. And, in fact, the story was published just months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And this story has a number of references to war. Uncle Rondo was a veteran of the First World War, and there are some suggestions that he is unnerved by the sounds of Independence Day fireworks. Shell shock? PTSD, maybe? Then he uses fireworks against Sister as an emotional weapon thrown in her room to frighten her. Then there's the story of Stella Rondo doing, quote, something perfectly horrible when she breaks a chain letter, supposedly from Flanders Field. And when Sister finally moves out to the post office, Uncle Rondo offers her his old army cot to sleep in. Interestingly, there are also references, or maybe sub-references, to Japan. The most obvious is probably the naming of a very minor character, Japan. Stella Rondo has a flesh-colored kimono that was part of her trousseau, and that kimono essentially gets into a brawl and winds up with ketchup all over it, sort of bloodying it. There's a strange reference to Mama's, quote, real tiny feet, at a time when large numbers of Americans, who at least in the rural South didn't always understand the distinctions between various Asian countries yet, were intrigued and a little horrified with the Chinese tradition of binding the feet of women to keep them small. The war-related images are all part of that sublayer of the story that Welty gives us, but her narrator doesn't intend. Let's go back to the radio itself. Hearing voices on the radio just isn't real communication, as I said. Not even as much communication as the silly arguments of her family. And the same basic situation is going on with the post office. This is supposed to be a place that explicitly allows for communication and connection between people. But that isn't what's going on here. Literally, since there's basically no mail going through, since her family won't darken the door, and also more metaphorically. Notably, the narrator is not even connecting with the person she's talking with. Well, not talking with, but talking to, or the person she's giving the monologue to. That person doesn't respond to her at all in the text. And given what Sister feels the need to explain in the monologue, that person doesn't seem to be a member of the community with any knowledge of the family either. So, yet another case of lack of true connection. She simply lassoed a passerby, apparently, and ranted to them, instead of actually engaging in conversation and connection. I mentioned earlier that I think we know Sister is telling this crazy story aloud to the visitor, rather than writing a letter or journal entry or short account for the reader. There are a couple of markers in the story that show that the narrative is not only oral, but in person. One is in this section, from the middle of the story. Just then, something perfectly horrible occurred to me. "Mama," I says, "can that child talk?" I simply had to whisper, "Mama, I wonder if that child can be, in any way. Do you realize," I says, "that she hasn't spoken one single solitary word to a human being up to this minute? This is the way she looks," I says, "and I look like this." Well, clearly Sister is making a face as she says this last sentence, and there's absolutely nothing in the text to describe what she looks like. Welty made a choice, a really interesting choice here, prioritizing the clear information that this is oral over any specific suggestion of the physical look. And I love how that works. I also love the ending of this story, and I will share just a bit of it. "And that's the last I've laid eyes on any of my family, or my family laid eyes on me, for 5 solid days and nights. Stella Rondo may be telling the most horrible tales in the world about Mr. Whittaker, but I haven't heard them. As I tell everybody, I draw my own conclusions." Quote, "That's the last." might momentarily lead us to think it's been quite a long time. But no, just 5 solid days and nights. Sister goes on, but here I am, and here I'll stay. I want the world to know I'm happy. And if Stella Rondo should come to me this minute on bended knees and attempt to explain the incidents of her life with Mr. Whittaker, I'd simply put my fingers in both my ears and refuse to listen. So right at the end, we yet again get the message that this story is about the inability to communicate or the unwillingness to do so. Still, I would bet that Sister will be back with her family in a few days. Maybe Uncle Rhonda will stop by with a picnic hamper full of breast of chicken or something to get her to come home. She'll be ending her isolationist ways. Sure as shooting. The story has a dark streak in it, but that dark streak isn't quite wide enough to convince me it won't be crossed back over. Well, there's a lot more that could be pulled out of this story, but I think we'll stop here for now. Thanks for joining me for the first night of Bookukkah here on Hannah's Books. See you tomorrow for the second night.